are as beings to all of what is out there around us. So the raison d'être, in summary, for the left hemisphere is to narrow things down to a certainty. And I'm going to use reading as my example here. We need to recognize a letter A, and we need to decide whether or not that A is going to say A or A. Okay, so there's a specific detail that needs to be sorted out before we can actually decode that particular word, and that's what our left hemisphere does beautifully. A right hemisphere is to open up, its raison d'etre is to open us up to possibility. So when I can decode that word, what does that word mean? And in life, of course, we need both. We need precision and we need the global picture. One of the things about the right hemisphere is that it is able to appreciate, and again, they have done all sorts of scientific studies looking at how the two parts of the brain function, how the kind of in action, and they look at them through the MRIs or whatever it is, PET scans or whatever it is they do. So these are generalizations that are based in neuroscience. So the right hemisphere appreciates that all things can change and flow and are never fixed and static. The left hemisphere sees them as fixed and static. And so again, is that a or an A sound, right? The left hemisphere would like it to decide it. Now, of course, in English, we can't decide whether it's an A or an A. If you were reading in Hungarian or if you're reading in Spanish, it would be very clear. Our left hemisphere would be very happy, but our right hemisphere has to put that letter in the context of the other letters that are there to decide which actual manifestation of the sound of letter A is going to happen. And so the right hemisphere sort of searches around until it can figure out what is supposed to happen. And that's what we mean about change and flow. And of course, they're not, and it sees things as not isolated or as atomistic, atomistic, word I haven't used often, but interconnected. Okay, so the right hemisphere connects things together and makes sense of them. What he has concluded is there's evidence that those of the highest intelligence, whatever their discipline, whether it is mathematics, whether it is physics, whether it is literature, whatever, that they rely more on the right hemisphere. And again, if you think about what researchers do, they take all the bits and pieces. Like, let's think about the researchers who were trying to create the vaccine for the coronavirus. They had to get all the bits and pieces of what made up a vaccine, but then they also had to imagine how these things interacted and what could happen. So the right hemisphere is very, very important, even in scientific research. So the right hemisphere tends to see more, is more in touch with reality. So it kind of can consider this and that and the other thing. It is actually quite sophisticated. We had a tendency to think of the right hemisphere as being artistic and emotional and all of these kind of non-tangible things. But when they really looked at a well-functioning brain, they realized that a lot of the sophistication of thought and problem solving depended on the right hemisphere. Whereas the left hemisphere, it processes things. It makes sure that we are correctly seeing what needs to be seen, but it doesn't actually pull things together from a comprehension point of view. And so it is the right hemisphere that is the basis of understanding. And this is why Dr. McGilchrist called his book The Master and His Emissary. The right hemisphere being the master hemisphere that sends the emissary, the left hemisphere, out to get information and bring it back. Without information, the right hemisphere won't be able to function in a society. It needs a left hemisphere, but to function in the society, it's not just about what you know, it's about how you understand what it is that you know. And McGilchrist's conclusion is, I believe that until very recently, there's been a blindness among neuroscientists to the contributions made by the right hemisphere. So very quickly, in terms of summary here, we have our left hemisphere that is about facts, decontextualization, focusing on rules and details, looking at the abstract and wanting an answer. And so again, if we use the idea of reading, it wants to be able to recognize the letters, decode the sounds, put the sounds together to make a word, words together to make a sentence, sentence together to make a paragraph. These are all activities that are very important But for a child, for any of us to understand what we read, we need the right hemisphere that can put those words into context in terms of the word itself, in terms of where it is in the sentence. Is it the word read or the word read? Well, that's going to depend on the sentence. How do I understand what's going on in this paragraph? So the right hemisphere makes sense of these details, considers the context, and seeks the understanding. Now, what we need to know here is that the right hemisphere is in rapid development during early childhood, but it requires experiences, not information to develop. And this is one of the reasons why play is so important, especially for our young children whose right hemisphere is in development. They need to have lots and lots of experiences. Telling them things does not grow the right hemisphere. Um, Between 1 and 3, there's a huge amount of blood flow in that right hemisphere. Absolutely. It does shift after 3 years, right around the time when you look at language and some of visual, spatial, and certain kinds of abilities that you need. So it starts to shift over at around 3 years of age, but it is nowhere, in full development at all. The development needs to continue. And so, yes, the right hemisphere, again, sort of ask ourselves, well, which is the most important hemisphere? Well, possibly the one that develops first. It's the one that we have to lean on. The corpus callosum, very interesting here. A huge growth spurt between ages of 3 and 6, and which results in improved coordination between the two hemispheres. And if you start thinking, if you've heard Dr. Neufeld speak or heard me speak and say, oh yes, integrative functioning, being able to say on the one hand, on the other hand, that's exactly about the communication between the hemispheres. The left hemisphere brings a detail, the right hemisphere puts it into context, goes back and gets another detail. So we need our corpus callosum for the brain to be able to do that. But it doesn't actually, there isn't, it's there, but it only starts really growing between 3 and 6. And it is one of the parts of the brain that continues to significantly grow and develop well into the mid-20s. So they did something like an etch-a-sketch, and I don't know if you guys know it, you have to use your right hand and your left hand to make things work. You know, prior to the age of 6 years old, most kids just can't do it. And it's not just a question of motor problems with their hand, it's also understanding how things go together. So we have to be